Okay, perfect.
Is it all good for you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And when you do the introduction, maybe Tigist, you can keep adding people or anyone.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Okay,
I like admitting people. It makes me
Feels
feel like I have
inclusive.
some power, you know?
great power.
If I don't admit you, you're going to stay there. So we have 6 people waiting.
Okay. Yeah, I think Tigis, if you want to let them in, you can.
Okay. Oh, did? Oh.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is. We'll go ahead and get the session started. Hi everyone. My name is Zachary Gersten. I'm the technological manager for this session. This is Macro Level Interventions B, and it's chaired by Dr. Kapui Ajay Bewonyo of the University of London. Thanks everyone for taking part in this last parallel session of this year's ANH Academy Week. Just as the ones before, we're very much looking forward to a robust and interactive session with you all. I'll just go through some really quick housekeeping items. First, you can access all of the materials on our website, which is anh-org/ANH2020. And this recording of the session, as well as their materials, you can find it there. Second, all of the participants, all of you have been muted, but we really want you to introduce yourselves. We want to know your names, your institution, where you're from. It'll help us know more about who's in the room. You can do this by putting your information in the chat box, just by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also encourage you to share your webcam if you want to, but totally understand if there are bandwidth issues and you need to turn it off. You can also upload a profile picture. I see some of you have already done that. I see Bhavani has Baby Yoda as his. But yeah, so you can definitely add a profile picture just so we can see your face. In the Q&A session, please add your questions in the chat box. We're collecting all of those and letting the session chair know which one, or giving them to the session chair. If we can, during the later stages of the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask your question aloud, just like in the last session. And if at any point you experience any technical issues, first check your audio settings. That's the first thing that you should check. And then your internet connection. You can try to reconnect to the session too. Just you exit out of the Zoom call and then come right back in using the same link and password. That tends to help too. If you have a technological question, feel free to message me privately in the chat box too, just by clicking on the drop down and clicking my name. I think that's it. Without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to our chair. Thanks, Kafui.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're all joining us from. My name is Kafui Ajay-Boanya, and I'm a research associate at the University College London, and I'm also a former Imana Fellow. So in this session, we'll be hearing about 4 macro-level interventions to address nutrition and food security in Africa and South Asia. And so we're looking forward to a very engaging session. We hope that you'll have an opportunity to watch the presenters' recorded presentations and read their abstracts from the ANH website. Here in this session, each presenter will be given about 3 minutes to summarize their research, and then we'll have hopefully about 40 minutes for questions and discussion. So we'll try to stick to the time, and without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters today. We have Dr. Edward Joy, Dr. Gregory Cooper, Dr. Molly Mulea, and Mr. Peter Mwangi, who will be presenting their very interesting research. So we'll start first with Dr. Edward Joy, who's an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he'll be presenting his abstract entitled First Report of Primary Findings from the AHA Trial. Can selenium deficiency in rural Malawi be addressed through consumption of maize flour biofortified with fertilizers? So Edward, could you start your presentation?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's great to be here. Thank you all for attending. So as mentioned, this is the first time that these findings have been reported, although some of you may have watched the video uploaded in advance of the session. So it's really exciting to be here with you today to present these findings. This is just a quick summary of a lot of work that's gone on, and a lot of people have put in a huge amount of time to this work. So I'll get, at the end, I'll briefly thank everyone, but just to remember at this point, this is the work of a lot of people. So to thank them up front as well. To summarize the background to this trial, in recent work led by Felix Piri, Felix found that through a national micronutrient survey that the prevalence of selenium deficiency in Malawi is high, but it's also spatially variable. So there are hotspots of deficiency in the red areas on the right-hand map there. And that's where we worked for this AHA trial. So Felix's work came out just in time that we were able to select an area near to Kasungu town in the central region of Malawi, in which to base ourselves, and in which we knew with a high degree of confidence that without any intervention, the participants would be at high risk of, or there would be high prevalence of selenium deficiency amongst our participants. And the aim of the trial, so again, going back to earlier work, we've seen that you can put small amounts of selenium onto maize through fertilizer, and that can successfully increase the selenium in your maize grain. What hadn't been tested certainly not in an experimental design in this context, was whether or not eating maize that's been enriched with selenium like this can actually improve your status. So that's what we set out to do. We grew the maize for the trial, and this is an aerial photo from a drone above Luana, Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources, who were the co-lead co-lead partners on the trial. And this is the farm at the university where we grew the maize. So some of this area is the control maize, and some of this area received the selenium fertilizer. You only need to put a tiny amount of selenium on, 1 or 2 teaspoons per hectare. So a hectare is about the size of a football field. A year before the trial, we conducted extensive formative research near to the study area. And Gabriella presented this yesterday. So if you're interested in that component of the work, I do encourage you to check that out. This was a really important part of the work. I don't have time to summarize it fully here, but just to say that there were a lot of findings we got from the formative work, which really helped us make some final decisions on the trial design, and importantly on the trial delivery, including our community sensitization approach. This is what the trial looks like on paper. We assessed the eligibility of households. We randomized and selected a random 180 households at random from those eligible households. And then they were randomly allocated into the control arm or the intervention arm. It was a placebo-controlled trial and double-blinded, so the participants and the trial research team did not know who was getting which treatment. And you can see we collected bloods before the intervention and after the intervention. The intervention itself lasted 8 to 9 weeks, in which households were getting all the maize flour they needed to meet their household needs. We had largely, I'd say, in a large part due to the formative work, a very high completion rate of the trial. So for our primary outcome, we were looking at selenium concentrations in the serum of blood. So we obviously had to take blood samples. Again, formative work was really important to make sure that the participants were aware of why we were doing this, what the blood was being used for, and so on. And here's a picture of a blood sample being taken. We processed it in the field, and the serum entered a cold chain and was eventually analyzed in the UK by ICPMS. Here is a distribution day, flour distribution day. You can see bags of flour here. They were allocated to households. Each bag had a unique code, so we could track that the right bag got to the right household. This is what selenium status looked like at baseline. And you can see it's quite very similar between the two trial arms. We split here the 2 demographic groups involved in the trial, women of reproductive age and school-age children. And that red dashed line, you want to be above that in order to have your optimal expression of a protein called GPX3, which is important for antioxidant function. So that's one way to measure deficiency. If you're below that, your antioxidant function is likely to be impaired due to your selenium deficiency. So ideally, we wanted this intervention to shift people in the intervention arm up above that line. And so here's what happened at N line. And so you can see 8 to 9 weeks of eating maize flour. This is the staple crop of Malawi. People eat it 2 to 3 times a day. It successfully moved the intervention group up above the threshold for deficiency, and the control group, there was no evidence of any change in their status. So this was a nice RCT to run with a nice positive outcome. Many of you were probably in the plenary session just now about complex interventions and multiple primary outcomes and so on. We were fortunate here to have a responsive primary outcome, and as we can see here, a nice clear effect of the intervention. So that's it really. I'm just presenting the primary findings today. There's still some work going on the secondary outcomes. As I mentioned, there's a long list of people involved in this trial, some on the call, so thank you very much to everyone involved in the trial. Particular thanks, really, I'd like to say to Dr. Alexander Kalimbira from Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources, who is the Malawi lead investigator for this trial, who turned his hand to many different aspects of the trial and really made it happen. But also to all the research assistants who joined us for sample and data collection and so on, to Leonard Bander, the trial manager, Gabriella, who led the formative work, and many others really. So a big thank you to all involved. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edward. And so now we'll have Dr. Gregory Cooper, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And he'll be presenting his abstract called Navigating the Nutrition-Based Trade-offs Arising from Horticultural Aggregation Schemes, a System Dynamics Approach. Thanks, Greg. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much, everybody. Just set my timer quickly. It's great to be with you all here today. Yeah, my name is Greg Cooper. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Again, I'd like to thank my co-authors here and all the funders. So I would just like to give a quick summary of some of the key work we're doing in the Market Intervention for Nutritional Improvement project. We are looking at the ways in which horticulture may be able to increase fruit and vegetable delivery to small, often rural, local-based markets, both in Bihar, India, and also in Jashore district in Bangladesh. And here is a photo of the particular intervention, the loop, the NGO Digital Green, which is in Bihar, India, and in Jashore. I tried to come up with a diagram which really summarizes kind of our problem statement, but also the overarching structure of our systems dynamics model. And I'd really encourage anyone who wants to know more about the design of the model, the parameterization of the model, to either pop some questions in the chat, go away and look at the 7-minute presentation on the website, and also some of the links there for more details around the model. These aggregation schemes can produce real producer-facing benefits in terms of cutting transportation costs to market, to linking smallholder farmers with larger markets and larger traders. But we know that when the loop scheme in Bihar scaled up, around about 70 to 80% of fruits and vegetables in this transported this scheme have been sent to larger, often wholesale-oriented urban markets. There's then a question around the extent to which these aggregation schemes may be able to benefit, actually kind of degrade the fruits and vegetables available in more local, often rural, kind of retail-oriented markets. We've built a model and we're looking to run scenarios which may be able to increase the availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables in these smaller markets, but also being sensitive around some of the trade-offs which farmers may face, thinking around their profits and the adoption of the scheme itself, willingness to participate in the aggregation scheme. So how can we address some of these trade-offs around equitable distribution of fruits and vegetables? And just to now quickly summarize some of the key results, what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is a trade-off diagram, and these are very much still preliminary, and I'd by all means welcome your feedback and suggestions and so on. On the right-hand side, or the right half of each of these diagrams, are consumer-facing outcomes in the smaller, local-oriented market. The demand for fruits and vegetables, price of fruits and vegetables in the markets, and the overall purchases of the fruits and vegetables. On the left-hand side are more producer-facing outcomes. Areas are negative outcomes relative to a baseline scenario, and blue positive outcomes relative to the baseline scenario. So if we scale up the aggregation scheme rapidly, we get essentially kind of real diversion of fruits and vegetables towards the urban areas at a real negative impact upon the more rural, smaller markets, as farmers are taking advantage of the higher prices, higher capacities of the rural areas. If we send a 30% of each aggregation of any given data to smaller local markets, see a marginal positive increase in the availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables in these markets, actually a negative trade-off on the actual aggregation scheme itself. It would recover essentially too much fruits and into the smaller market, and there's higher wastage and finally from me, just a couple of further scenarios which really can generate real positive and significant outcomes in the consumer-facing dimensions. In cold storage into the small market, which extends the 21 days, can help to generate significantly better, more affordable prices and higher demands for fruits and vegetables in these smaller markets. Combining both internal and external kind of changes to the system, storage, adding a quota, 20% quota of aggregation going to the smaller market, can really kind of unlock some of the real consumer-facing outcomes, avoiding any significant trade-offs on producers. So to conclude, it's a bit of a whirlwind, and I appreciate a lot of the modelling detail that's not shown at all, but really aggregation schemes have potential to increase the availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables in small rural markets, but their design and the way we use and evolve aggregation schemes must be sensitive to some of the underlying problems with markets in these rural environments, some of the inequalities and some of the more kind of attractiveness of the urban markets, which tends to pull fruits and towards urban wholesale markets. I'll leave it there and welcome your questions and say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. So now we'll have Dr. Molly Mulea, who's a research fellow from the University of Nottingham, and she will be presenting her abstract, Biofortification of Staple Crops with Selenium Fertilizers, Speciation and Bioaccessibility. Molly?
Okay, sorry. Can everyone see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the speciation and bioaccessibility of selenium biofortified crops of dietary importance from Malawi. So this is work that I did when I was an Imana Fellow from 2018 to 2019. So I will just jump right in. I will start by giving just a brief background of this study. So suboptimal intakes of selenium are common in many parts of the world where soils are largely selenium deficient. And the uptake of selenium from soils to crops is an important entry point of selenium into the food system. So it's not surprising that agronomic biofortification is an effective strategy to increase selenium supply in the food systems of regions where it is lacking. And agronomic biofortification is achieved through the application of selenium-enriched fertilizers. Now, the effectiveness of biofortified crops is underpinned by the bioaccessibility of the biofortified mineral. And bioaccessibility refers to the proportion of minerals that are potentially available for absorption. So although increased concentrations are obtained after biofortification, there is no control over the factors that affect bioaccessibility, such as the type of chemical species that are formed, with some species more bioaccessible than others, or the type of food matrix and other differences that could be induced through processing. In addition to that, the use of enriched fertilizers means that two different sources of selenium accumulate in the edible portions of crops. This one derived from soil and one from the applied fertilizer. And it is important for us to understand whether there are differences in the speciation and bioaccessibility of these different sources of selenium. So in our study, we investigated these aspects using selenium biofortified maize, cowpea, and groundnut from Malawi. These crops were obtained from an isotopically labeled field trial at Chiteze Research Center in Malawi. And isotopic labeling allowed for the discrimination between the native selenium from soil and selenium from fertilizer. We went on to do speciation and bioaccessibility studies using standard protocols. This graph shows a typical chromatogram from the speciation analysis of maize grain with peaks of native selenium from soil in red and applied selenium from fertilizer in blue. We can see that both profiles are similar, differing only in magnitude. And this relationship was the same for cowpea and groundnut as well. And this showed that the selenium from soil and fertilizer were converted into similar species. Pertaining to the identified species, we found that more than 90% of the selenium species were in an organic form, and selenomethionine was the dominant species. We also found an interesting finding, which was the occurrence of substantial levels of selenomethylcysteine in cowpea. In terms of the bioaccessibility, we found no differences in percent bioaccessibility across all the crops, with an average bioaccessibility of around 72%. This high bioaccessibility is probably because of the dominance of organic species, which are highly bioaccessible. If we look in terms of concentration, we can see that groundnut can provide more bioaccessible selenium than both maize and cowpea because it had higher selenium concentration. However, the bioaccessible selenium concentrations in maize and cowpea are still more than enough to meet the recommended dietary requirements. So to conclude this study, we have shown that selenium biofortification of staple crops is a viable strategy that leads to the accumulation of highly bioaccessible organic selenium species. The accumulation of selenomethylcysteine in cowpea deserves further attention because it could lead to more health benefits that go beyond improving selenium status. This is because selenomethylcysteine is one of the most potent anti-carcinogenic selenium species. So thank you to everyone who contributed to this work. And yeah, more gratitude goes to Ivy Ligowe, who is the one who did the isotopic study. And thanks to everyone who contributed in the analytical work. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. And finally, we will have Mr. Peter Mwangi, who's a project officer at the Ministry of Environment and a student at the University of Nairobi. He will be presenting his paper, Effects of Area Yield Index Insurance on Food Security, Case Study of Njoro Sub-County, Kenya. Please, Peter.
Okay, thank you. So this was a study that was done to estimate whether crop insurance has any effect on food security, because as you know, in most developing countries, a lot of countries believe that crop insurance as a food security issue, they need something or some impact so that can be able to address this problem. So we were trying to see what is the trend, how is the general performance of this program, because it's actually an initiative of a government. It has come up with this program. So as you can see, we have those two pictures there. You have one case where we have drought here, and another case where you have a good harvest. So you are trying to, since we are looking at farmers' decision to adopt insurance or not to adopt, so you had to do a survey and ask them, has it helped you? So we had very interesting statistics. As you can see, it was looking at 2017, 2018, and 2019. 2017, that 2% had insured. For 2018, we had 28%, and for 2019, 29%. And you can see from that diagram, we can see those who participated in both 2017 and 2018 represented only 11%, meaning that the enrolling back to the program had a declining trend. And this was largely due to non-compensation issue, whereby farmers were saying that the program could not meet their expectation. This was more or less due to basis risks. You could, one farmer could have incurred a loss, but since the losses are not localized, they were not compensated. You can see from this now diagram is now here reason for those people who did not insure at first. We had also, there are some reason, a large number said that they did not see any importance of them joining the program, because as you know, insurance program is whereby it is like a gap, it's a 50-50. You either get compensated if you harvest lower than the actual yield, or you don't get compensated if you harvest above the average. So that was one of their reasons. Other could say that it was unavailable. Yes, they wanted it, but by the time they wanted to insure, the program was already not present at their locality. Other, they had some reasons say that they could not understand how it is working. So it means that there was no awareness or knowledge gap. And lastly, there are those who were more or less concerned of the costs, because they were saying, if I put my money, then I'll definitely lose. So I don't see most of the value. So it's relatively more or less expensive. And now you can see this, the table basically where I was now trying to look at what is driving someone to insure or not to insure. And still the result was so or more or less interesting. You can see the gender had a negative impact, whereby it represents a typical African culture setting whereby male, if you are male, there is less chance for you to adapt, because as you know, most of African settings whereby female are more or less given that opportunity to like be the breadwinners or to ensure that the kids are able to feed. Similarly, you can see for education, it was a bit significant. Primarily and secondary, they were significant at 10%. But if you go to tertiary, it was interesting, it was significant at 5%, meaning that as people are able to advance in education level, they get more information on the opportunities and benefit associated with this insurance. You can see also the size under lard and maize. It was significant at 1%. Basically, it's because this program more or less addresses maize. It is able to, at the first piece, it is supposed to address maize and wheat, but mostly for my case, I was looking for the maize. So you can see as you increase the size of lard and maize, you have higher chances of adopting. Still, non-farm income had a significant influence, since if you have more income, you have disposable income, so that you can be able to use some to hedge yourself against production risk in farming. You can see something like distance had a negative influence, meaning that, remember, if distance increases, it means that the cost are able to increase the transaction cost. That's why the adoption decision, distance had a negative influence. Still, you can see large tenure and maize or relatively the ownership. If you own a piece of land, you can insure that piece rather than the one that you are insuring, the one that, sorry, you are on lease. Because if you are leasing a piece of land, you will incur an extra cost of leasing. So those who are farming on their own piece, the decision was higher. They had a higher likelihood to adopt than those who are on lease. Similarly, you can see access to agriculture credit. If you're able to access agriculture credit, means that you have the financial literacy to understand on financial derivatives, that's such as the loan, insurance, so they have a better chance of adopting. Still, you can see, for example, here, age was still significant, meaning that as you get older, you are trying to ensure that there's sustainability in the food security on your side. So you don't want to fight to get in a place whereby like your livelihood is compromised because you don't have stable food sources. And lastly, you can see group membership. Participating in a farming group was significant. This is because when you are in a group, it means that you're able to find the information on this farming method, input supply, as well as the insurance. And last year I tried to look at now the treatment itself, where I was trying to look at the observed case and the counterfactual. So you can see at this place here, if a farmer who adopted insurance choose not to adopt, the food insecurity index could have increased from 4.9 to 5.7. And remember, since I was using the household food insecurity index, it means that the higher the index, the higher you are food insecure or less food secure. Similarly, looking at the counterfactual, assuming that the person who insured, if he had not insured, what could have happened? Then the person who had not insured, if the person had insured, what could happen? So look at the counterfactual, you could see the person who did not insure, the index was 4.3. But if that person had insured, the index was 4.31. So you can slightly, he could have reduced the food insecurity index roughly by 0.45, thus making them food secure. Therefore, in conclusion, is that the number, although the number is marginally smaller, declining, food security had an impact of reducing food insecurity index. Therefore, I looked at what could be the alternative or the solution for such an initiative. So there was a need for a feedback mechanism, this basically whereby you're able to engage farmers in the design so that you're able to produce a target product that is able to feed the market. Still, you need
very much, Peter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll go to the question and answer now. I see that we have quite a few questions coming in, and we'll start with, we have a few questions for Edward and on the selenium trial, and some of these might also apply to Molly's presentation as well. So we had a question from Kate Schneider about whether selenium toxicity can be reached from food sources alone, and if there's a risk of exceeding the upper levels of selenium intakes. Ed, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yes, you can reach selenium toxicity levels. It's very rare that this occurs. There are case reports of people who have eaten hundreds of Brazil nuts in a very short space of time because they thought it was good for them, and they've come to the doctor with selenium toxicity. This doesn't happen, obviously, in this is not commonplace. And what we see with agronomic biofortification is because you can adjust the amount of selenium that goes in, and also there's, if you like, a filter because it's coming through a staple crop and you're not going to be able to overeat the staple crop too much. You can really manage that risk. I mean, the other thing to say is that as you biofortify the crop, you're raising the selenium concentration up to levels that you would get if you were growing the crop in a non-selenium deficient soil. So your aim and what you achieve is moving people's dietary intake up to the sort of level they would get if they were living 100 kilometers closer to Lake Malawi on a different type of soil. So that also gives us some confidence that that we're not going to see toxic levels of intake, and the intake levels that we were targeting and achieving in the trial were well below what might cause toxicity. But it is, I mean, it is a potential risk, and it's one of the reasons why agronomic biofortification might be a safer strategy than fortifying foods at the processing stage. If the processor added too much selenium, for example, in the same way that iodine is added to salt, you could add selenium to salt. If that was really tightly managed, it might be okay. If it wasn't managed well, you could get more easily, you could get too much selenium into the diet.
Thank you. And we'll just have a quick follow-up question for you, which was how you ensured that people were eating the fortified maize and not their usual maize.
That's a really good question, and this is partly where the formative work came in. And it was a risk that we identified as we discussed the intervention. We thought, you know, we could go and distribute all this flour and people would just stash it or give it to a neighbor or sell it, or I think make papier-mâché animals was one of the options. That was part of the community sensitization, I would say. So we really tried to work with the participant community and bring them on board as partners in the trial. So that meant that we spent a lot of time in village discussions and village gatherings, discussing what it means, what a micronutrient deficiency means, and why for the trial it would be important that people ate the flour that we provided. And we really, those conversations were fascinating to witness. Obviously they had to be translated for my benefit, but it was really interesting to hear those and to hear the thoughts of the community. And by the time we were implementing, we really had the community on board with the trial, and people knew why it was important to eat what we provided to them. And there were more steps, I guess, in getting the community on board. We had lots of the community came to visit the site where we were growing the maize, so that they could see there wasn't anything funny going on. This looked like the sort of maize they would grow at home. They got to ask questions of the farm management team and that kind of thing. And we had a community dish sharing event, which again really brought everyone on board. So yeah, lots of work went into that, and I guess the primary outcome did show us that people were eating it. That's one thing. We had also continuous conversations going on with participants to ask them if they're facing any difficulties consuming it or any fears. And yeah, I think we can say it worked in this context, but a lot of effort went into making that happen.
Okay, thank you. And I see we have a few more questions on the selenium studies, and so I'll pose these to both Molly and to Ed. One question is it seems like it's a cost-effective strategy using this biofortification. So a few people are wondering what's next for scale up, and why selenium versus other micronutrients, whether there might be a case for biofortification of zinc as well. So Molly or Ed, would you have any responses to these questions?
Molly, do you want to start? I'm happy to come in after. Molly, do you want to?
No, you can go ahead.
Do you want me to go ahead? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, a couple of questions in there. So I guess, yeah, selenium. It's responsive. You put it through the fertilizer, either onto the soil, and the crop takes it up. So Ivy and Molly's work has really shown that, and other trials, other field trials, agronomic trials have shown that as well. I think if you compare it to other minerals, you can put zinc in fertilizer, and people do that partly for crop health and crop response. But a lot of the zinc you apply will stick in the soil and not get into the crop. And you would be looking at applying kilograms per hectare of zinc, not teaspoons. So the cost equation becomes quite different. I think, anything else, Molly? Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think probably also if you look at the increment that you see when selenium is added compared to when zinc is added, it's quite different, which means that in terms of bioaccessibility, the gains for zinc are likely to be much lower because you have other effects due to processing and due to bioaccessibility, like what I discussed in my presentation. So for zinc, you have much lower gains after biofortification than for selenium. If you looked at the profile that I showed for the native selenium from soil and the one from applied selenium, we saw that there was like a 10 times magnitude of increment in selenium. But for zinc, we are seeing increases of sometimes less than 50% in the grain. And sometimes a lot of that zinc is actually going into the outer layers of the grain where it's not released during digestion.
Thanks, Molly. And we have a couple more questions for you. One is whether there's a difference in bioaccessibility between selenium with foliar application versus selenium from the soil. And the other is, what would a national strategy on selenium fertilizers look like in Malawi?
Yeah, so I will answer the one on the bioaccessibility for foliar and soil application. So in this study, we did not look at foliar application. The selenium was added through the soil. So what we were interested in was to look at whether there are differences in the type of selenium compounds that are formed from the selenium that is applied through the fertilizer or the native selenium that is derived from the soil. So we did not look at foliar application, and we also have not established whether if you do foliar application, if you form the same species as the species that are formed when the selenium is derived straight from the soil. So that is something that would be interesting to look at for crops where foliar application is done.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a question for Greg, which is whether you're looking into using your approach for any other country context.
Sure, well, thank you for that question, and it's a really good question. The short answer would be yes. Currently in the mini project, there is also modeling work going on in Bangladesh, led by Bangladesh University. And they're also developing a systems model to look at the system in there are many similarities in context in terms of the traditional spot-based marketing system, horticulture, similar seasons and so on. There are differences in terms of the actual numerical parameters and data which are informing their model. And it's one of the strengths, there are weaknesses as well, but it's one of the strengths of systems modeling that kind of take these concepts, and as long as you can express a system as a interlinked series of stocks, flows, and feedbacks, then you can essentially take the modeling framework anywhere, then find the appropriate data and the ability to express different relationships quantitatively in equation form. And then you have to also show you can validate the model and it does what it's supposed to do qualitatively and quantitatively. So yes, it's currently ongoing in Bangladesh as well. Also, there's lots of similar work going on around the world, really.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question for Martin that's come up, which is how can we make insurance schemes more accessible to farmers? Are you planning to conduct more qualitative research to understand the barriers that farmers are facing? This is for Peter.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that question. There's also an ongoing work for extra counties. For example, you have to look for all the piloted counties. And generally, to ensure that this insurance is able to reach almost everyone, there's a need first to address the business risk, which is made to be a bit major problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I saw in your abstract that you mentioned some potential strategies of like having more stakeholder involvement and farmer awareness and training about better regulation for the insurance sectors. Could you expand on some of these potential strategies of how, you mentioned like bundling the crop insurance services with other services such as credits and loans and extension services. Could you expand a little bit on how you think some of these strategies might help farmers to take up crop insurance?
Thank you. For example, looking at bundling the crop insurance with other product, for example, the loan or credit. If you facilitate farmers with credit, you're able to buy improved farm inputs, such as fertilizer. So if there is that opportunity, people will be able to engage in that process because they'll be knowing if I adopt this insurance, I'm able to assess all the improved services. I'll be able also to assess the agriculture extension services, which is a key area in farming. For example, during the interviews, most of the farmers were saying that the extension services they got from the county agricultural officers, they were so helpful, so that they help them to transit from the old farming methods, for example, intercropping, and coming to monocropping, whereby if it is maize, they designate a certain piece of land, and they plant only maize based on specific, maybe if it is spacing, fertilizer application, and such. So that's a key to it. Still, for the development of regulation, we realize that it takes some time for people to get back their payments. Almost a year, others like 2 years. So the farmers were echoing that if it was possible to shorten the period for the payment, so that if, for example, incur loss this year, for example, 2020, so that you don't have to wait up to 2021 or 2022, so that you can be able to receive your payment. So if there is such rules, because they have already paid, because before the planting cycle, they already paid the insurance. So if they're able to get before the following year, it can be able to help them maybe to enroll back to the insurance the following year.
Okay, thank you so much. While we wait for some more questions to come in, I also have a question for Greg, or it looks like another question has just come in for Greg. So this is coming from Zachary Gersten for the different scenarios where consumer benefits are dominant and where producers drastically lose profits, what are the timescales for these kinds of outcomes, and what was your approach for finding the optimal outcome?
Really great question. Okay, yes, I didn't really detail that at all in this brief, but essentially the simulations were over the period of 6 years, 5 years, but sort of a year for parameterization, and the scenario was over 5 years. And the diagrams which I showed essentially were to think about whether we do the mean, or whether we show some element of some variance within the simulations. Systems dynamics outcomes are often are normally expressed as time series, so trying to summarize these outcomes. So that's over a 5-year timescale, and obviously we could go further. The uncertainties start to increase the further into future you simulate. So currently we're looking at 5-year timescale. In terms of finding an optimal outcome, that's again a really good question. We haven't so far tried to find an optimal outcome. Could use some form of optimization. Currently it's a bit more kind of exploratory. What are the, are there any nonlinear effects, for example, if we combined different different internal changes to the aggregation system with wider changes to the enabling environment, cold storage, or improvements in road infrastructure and cutting transport costs, for example. So it is a possibility we could do some optimization. We need to improve our where we parameterize costs within the model, for example. So there would be some elements of optimizing for different investments, perhaps at the state level, in cold storage or infrastructure improvement. But in terms of an actual formal optimization process, we haven't got about doing that yet. And it will be something, if we could go along that line, or we would have to make at some point some normative judgment around which scenario is optimal. Or really kind of the original aim was to find a scenario which does provide consumer benefits whilst avoiding trade-offs in the producer, some key producer outcomes. So if we then look for actual optimal scenarios is a possibility, but currently we haven't done yet. So.
Okay, thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, you found that when the cold storage was used in addition to the aggregation scheme, that seemed to have some of the best trade-offs for the producers versus consumers. Is that right?
That's right. And cold storage in Bihar in India is a really interesting one, because there is cold storage infrastructure, but around about 95% of all cold storage infrastructure in Bihar is used for potato and onion. Yes. So there is the cold storage there, and often in market environments, but it's held by kind of potato traders and producers. Recently, just very quickly, the Indian government, as part of their COVID response, are trying to liberate some of their supply chains and trying to improve access of smallholders to cold storage facilities. So yes, like it's a scenario which is suggesting that kind of the better you can capture the fruits and vegetables in these more local market environments, it has a stabilizing effect on the price, where otherwise wastage might be high, and that would affect demand and so on. So we still have to play around with the cost of cold storage, but yeah, that was just some initial findings there.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like we have another question from Kate Schneider for Edward and Molly, which is, are you planning any cost effectiveness analyses comparing the biofortification through soil fertilizer to traditional fortification like processors or at-home sachets or other options? And have you thought about the potential for protective effects of selenium sufficiency when exposed to aflatoxin? Edward and Molly, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Sure. These are really, really good questions. Cost effectiveness to start with. It's, I think as explained, you don't need very much selenium on your crop, and it is potentially a very cost-effective intervention, but there still needs to be more work done to estimate cost effectiveness more fully. And really, I think that depends on the intervention option that you select, or the route that you go down, whether you tag on the back of the fertilizer input subsidy scheme, for example, whether you make it a national mandatory requirement to include selenium in fertilizer, like they do in Finland, for example. So I think the discussion now needs to go with the agriculture and nutrition communities, with policymakers in Malawi. Certainly that's our plan, is to talk to them about what they would like to do really as a next step, and what potential policy route they would like to take it down. And then that's where there will be a real need to do cost effectiveness analyses and work out how much it's costing to reach different particular at-risk groups, and yeah, how much it's costing compared to other intervention strategies. And I think, as I mentioned, the agronomic biofortification is possibly preferable for safety reasons. There is still also a cost effectiveness consideration. You could look to achieve widespread supplementation. I think that would be quite costly. Or you could do fortification of foods at processing stage. But in Malawi, most people mill their maize at small local maize mills. So you'd either need the millers or private households to manage that themselves. And again, there's potential security concerns, but also I think you would find potentially quite low compliance or adherence to any intervention like that. So we do think that the fertilizer route is very, there's a lot of optimism that that could be rolled out and achieve quite high uptakes, including in the rural communities that we're trying to reach. I don't know about the aflatoxin one, Molly. I really don't know about that. So I don't know if you've got any comments on whether that protects you potentially against aflatoxin.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not really sure about the aflatoxin protective effect as well. But what I just want to say is that there's a lot of opportunities on what else can be done after agronomic biofortification because of the other added benefits of selenium. So you have that aflatoxin effect that you've mentioned, but there are also other effects like the high chemopreventative effects. So there's a lot of opportunities of people collaborating and trying to carry out these studies to look at whether you have these chemopreventive effects or whether you have this aflatoxin effect. I think it would be really some interesting research to do.
Thank you. So it looks like those are all the questions. I'll just ask one final one to Greg, which is to Peter, which is that in your study, you found that farmers were reluctant to take up the crop insurance in part, or they dropped out after a while because of the risk of non-compensation, that they weren't being compensated. Do you have any ideas of how to address that issue so that farmers will see the benefits of crop insurance?
Yes, thank you. I think the first initiative is basically working with the agriculture extension officers, because they are the one who partner with the insurance company, because actually the work of the national government is that provide the policy environment, whereas the private sector, because actually it was a PPT, a public-private program. So the private sector comes in to ensure that there's distribution of the policies, the payout. So if the government can provide a regulatory framework whereby there is that composition in real time, because you can find some farmers who are saying that, oh, out of 20 people who were supposed to be compensated, 5 already have been compensated, the rest 15 have not been compensated. So if we can have a policy regulation whereby you have a real time maybe payment, maybe I think that can be a plus to ensure the compensation is done in time. And also maybe awareness whereby you tell the farmers that this is an insurance, it is a 50-50. If you incur loss, you'll be able to be compensated. If you don't incur, you won't be compensated. Because even some were saying, why should person A be compensated and person B not be compensated? So I think more or less the training, let them know what are the benefits embedded with that insurance.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you all for a very interesting session. I think we've learned a lot. You know, the session really stressed the importance of interventions that don't rely solely on changes to individual behaviors, but address some of these broader systems and environments that shape nutrition, agriculture, and health. So we heard about a randomized controlled trial to test whether biofortification of maize in Malawi could lead to reductions in selenium deficiency. And I think this work is very timely, especially given a lot of the renewed interest in and debate around randomized controlled trials and how they can be used in different fields. So, and we also heard about research from Bihar, India on how different models and scenarios for how horticultural aggregation schemes could help to serve nutritionally vulnerable markets in rural areas, in addition to the large and profitable urban markets, and how broader changes in the value chain can also help to improve the benefits for both producers and consumers. We also saw that selenium fertilization in Malawi greatly increased the amount of selenium available in stable crops, and that it was transformed into bioaccessible forms. In addition, we saw that in Molly's presentation that selenium fortification in legumes such as groundnuts may be a promising source of selenium and plant-based protein. And finally, we saw in Peter's presentation in Kenya that factors such as education are associated with the adoption of crop insurance. And however, the adoption of crop insurance was low, but he found that having crop insurance would reduce food insecurity. So I think we heard a lot of very interesting research, and I hope that there's further attention paid to food systems and macro level interventions that can lead to improvements in nutrition and health. So thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you to the presenters for sharing their research. And unless there are any other comments or questions, then I think we will wrap up.
Awesome. Thank you, Kapwi, for chairing, and thanks to all the presenters. I just have some quick announcements. Abel has kindly posted them in the chat, so you can read them there too. We're going to spend the next 5 minutes voting on posters. So you can use the links that Abel just sent. If you go there, you can peruse the posters, I guess, in 5 minutes. But then definitely vote, because there are going to be prizes for the whoever the majority votes for. So please be sure to do that. There are some quick timing changes. So we've moved the closing ceremony to 15:20, and then the final social hangout will start at 16 o'clock. We'll have like live music actually in the social hangout, so please be sure to join. We recommend you bring an appropriate drink for the time that you're in. Like I'm sure people in later time zones will have something else than me, who's still in the morning. But thanks again so much for joining this last session, and we'll see you at the closing ceremony.
Bye.